Okay, good evening, everyone. I'll be starting in about a minute. A lot of mosquitoes here. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Okay, welcome everybody to Thursday night live stream. What I'm doing currently is a series based on the Mahānāma Sutta, which is in the Anguttara Nikaya Book of Elevens. And the Buddha in that sutta is speaking to a lay follower who asks how should he manage his practice when he's got a busy life and many things to do. And the Buddha gives him 5 qualities to be developed and 6 contemplations. And so we're going through them one by one. The 5 qualities to be developed is actually the same list as the 5 faculties, the 5 indriya. That is, excuse me, faith, energy, mindfulness, samadhi, and wisdom. And last week we did saddha, or faith, and the theme of tonight's talk will be viriya, or energy. As I said, this is the list of faculties to be developed, and it's the same as the list of the 5 indriya. And it's elsewhere explained in the 5 indriya that energy and samadhi are a balanced pair, in that the two have to be developed together. Or if one gets ahead of the other, then there's an imbalance in the practice, and the practice doesn't progress. If energy is developed and samadhi is not, then this results in restlessness. The mind that can't stay still, the body that is not at ease and wants to fidget and move. This is a sign of excess of viriya and in relation to samadhi. Now, the samadhi is not developed to the same extent, then the viriya will be a kind of unconstrained energy. But if energy is too low, then the meditator experiences dullness and sleepiness and lethargy, kind of lazy mind or sleepy mind. And that's equally problematic. And that's a result of samadhi being overdeveloped at the expense of viriya. And the samadhi then becomes miccha samadhi, or wrong samadhi, and leads to a kind of a dull, sleepy state that the Thai tradition calls a bhavanga, which you'll see that in writings of Thai ajahns. And the word bhavanga used by the Thais is a word borrowed from Abhidhamma, but it doesn't have this exactly the same meaning as in Abhidhamma. So if you're an Abhidhamma scholar, don't be confused if you pick up a Thai forest discourse and they're talking about bhavanga. What they're talking about is the state of low energy, where the meditator feels very dull and dark and sleepy, kind of dreamy state. They can even feel kind of pleasant, and people can fool themselves into thinking they're meditating well, but it's without any energy, without any brightness. Developing energy is very important. The Buddha spoke about it often, and he said that the path and the fruit are for the energetic, not for the slothful. One has to put in the effort. Right effort. Samavayamo is one of the path factors, of course. So we need to have energy if we're going to make any progress on the path. And I think everybody who's taken up meditation at some point encounters a state of low energy when you need to energize, but you're dull. There is one sutta in the Anguttara Nikaya. It's in the book of Sevens. I'm looking at it now, where the Buddha came to see Moggallana before Moggallana was awakened, when he was just starting out. He hadn't yet attained to the path. And Moggallana was at that time struggling with sleepiness. He came across Moggallana sitting dozing. And the Buddha then gives a series of measures, progressive measures, to arouse oneself if sleepiness is overcoming one, if the energy level is low. He begins with, therefore, Moggallana, you should not attend to or cultivate the object that you were attending to when you became drowsy. By such means, it is possible that your drowsiness will be abandoned. This is quite important. It's the first one that he mentions. You should not attend to the object you were attending to when drowsiness arose. This relates directly to the principle that samadhi and viriya need to be developed together, that they support one another, but if they're out of balance, then they become a hindrance to each other. And if the one is, say, practicing meditation on the breath and getting sleepy and drowsy, some people may naively think they should just try to focus on the breath harder. That won't work. That's contraindicated, because if you're low in energy, that samadhi is miccha samadhi, and you become becomes kind of hypnotic. So the Buddha is saying, if you're drowsy, that's not the time to develop samadhi. That's not the time to focus on your object. You need to rouse yourself somehow first before you can properly attend to your object. So he goes through then to the next one. But if you cannot abandon your drowsiness in such a way, you should ponder, examine, and mentally inspect the Dhamma as you have heard it and learned it. By such means, you may overcome the drowsiness. So now he's saying to actively engage the mind, the thinking process, which would be exactly the wrong thing to do if you're restless. It's always the opposite. If you're restless or if you're drowsy, the proper remedies are opposite. So you want to engage the mind and bring forward the thinking process and reflect and ponder on Dhamma. So keeping the mind engaged with the spiritual work, but not easing off on the attempt to develop samadhi. You won't succeed anyway if the energy level is low. So brighten the mind with contemplation of Dhamma. In the 7 enlightenment factors, Dhamma Vichaya, or investigation, is one of the energizing factors. Then, and these steps are graded. So you try one. If it doesn't work, you try the next. If you cannot abandon your drowsiness in such a way, then you should recite in detail the Dhamma you have heard and learned. So this is basically chanting. Chanting is chanting passages in Pali is a practice that brightens and energizes and refreshes the mind. It's very traditional in Theravada monasteries to begin a session of meditation with some chanting. And if you have some understanding of the meaning of the words, not necessarily even understanding them in detail word for word, but if you understand the meaning of the words, that is even more effective. But just the effort of reciting a memorized passage is energizing. And then going into physical remedies. If you cannot abandon your drowsiness so far, then you should pull both ears and rub your limbs with your hands. So, shaking yourself awake and pulling on your ears and rubbing your limbs. That's kind of ways of kind of shaking or shocking yourself awake. That you need to somehow overcome that drowsiness before your meditation will be successful. Then the next one, and you see these are progressive. They're getting more. You're getting more further away from just sitting still and watching the breath. If you still can't wake up, then what you do is get up from your seat, rub your eyes with water, survey the 4 quarters, and then look up at the constellations and stars. So open up the consciousness, take in the surroundings. So this is splash water in your face. One thing that you can do if you live in a climate like we do is in the wintertime, you can use the snow. A handful of snow on the back of the neck is one sure way of waking you up. Another one is walking a little bit outside in the snow in your bare feet, taking a few steps. But this is just in general finding ways to kind of shock yourself awake, overcome that sleepiness, not giving into it. Then he goes on to a meditation that you can take up that helps to overcome drowsiness, which is the perception of light. You fill your consciousness with light. You imagine that even if it's in a dark room or a cave, you imagine it's flooded with light, bright light. This is this is a way of overcoming your drowsiness. Because that drowsy mind, even if the surroundings are light, it's daylight, With a drowsy mind, it feels dark. It feels dark inside. So you try and disperse that with brightness. And then he goes on to abandon your drowsiness by walking meditation, walking back and forth, perceiving what is behind you and what is in front with your sense faculties drawn in and your mind collected. So that's actually generally a good principle if you're using walking meditation to balance sitting meditation in your practice. You can fine-tune your practice quite a bit by the use of walking meditation. It's always good to intersperse walking and sitting, but if your tendency is towards restlessness, then you should walk less, and when you walk, you should walk very slowly. If your tendency is towards sleepiness, then you should walk more, do a longer walking session, and walk somewhat more briskly. And you can use that walking meditation to fine tune your state of mind. It's very powerful that way. And then finally, if everything else fails, it might be a possibility that you're just physically exhausted, which then nothing is going to help. So he suggests, this is the Buddha, suggests lying down on your right side in a lion's posture and establish in your mind clearly the intention to wake, and allow yourself to have a brief nap, and then wake up in like 20 minutes or so. He doesn't specify a time here, of course. They didn't use times like that, but one of the commentaries says that the correct amount of time is if you've just washed your face, the time it takes for the water to dry. So it's probably 15-20 minutes. So you lie down on the right side, lion's posture, and establish clearly before you let yourself sleep. Establish clearly the intention of quickly rising, and get up in 15 or 20 minutes very quickly. Don't, as he says, do not give in to the pleasure of sloth, the pleasure of sleep. Get up quickly. And that's just a general rule for life, really, is you're better off in the mornings getting up quickly rather than slowly rising from the murk of unconsciousness and dragging yourself reluctantly, or just get up and get on with it. So this was given to Moggallana, who, of course, as we know, went on to become an arahant and one of the two chief disciples, and the chief disciple most renowned for psychic powers. So, so if you find yourself having trouble with sleepiness, don't think you're a hopeless case, because even Moggallana had that difficulty early on. There is in this is a little bit of a digression, but there is in the Visuddhimagga an analysis of personality types based on your primary defilement, whether it's greed, hatred, or delusion. I mean, everybody's got a mix of all three, but you'll have probably one that's predominant, and it's the deluded type that develops psychic powers. Which is interesting. Moggallana developed psychic powers, and deluded type would be the type most prone to drowsiness and dreaminess, who would enjoy going into a kind of dreamy, dull state. That would be a deluded mind. So we are going to 2 weeks from now, we're going. If I'm following the order in the text, that 2 weeks from now we will deal with samadhi, which is the balancing factor for viriya, and talk about how the proper ways of developing samadhi and how it relates to viriya. So I'll leave it there and answer questions. Okay, here we go. First question. Bhante, can a Pacheco Buddha arise in a time when the Dhamma still exists? Or is it prerequisite for Pacheco Buddha to wait for a time when there is no Dhamma? No, Pacheco Buddha only arises in a period of time when the Dhamma is forgotten. An individual like that arising in a time when there is Dhamma would become an arahant. Is samvega an overall energizing factor? Yes, I would say it is. Samvega, for those who don't know, is how do you translate it? It's like aspiration, earnestness, a sense of out of love for the Dhamma, respect and love for the Dhamma, one feels motivated. What is your take on the vow to refrain from X amount of nights from sleeping, all-night meditation? How does this benefit in the spiritual life? Yeah, good question. There is different approaches to that of sleep fasting. Reducing the hours of sleep is probably a good thing in general. All-night meditation works as beneficial for some people. For other people, it just makes them more dull the next day and doesn't seem to have a great benefit. There's also the practice, the sitting practice, which is to make a vow for a period of time never to lie down. You allow yourself to sleep, but only in a sitting posture. So you never get really deeply asleep. You can't sleep for long that way. That's also, I think, has its pluses and minuses. I think if you've got any kind of back trouble, you stay away from it, because it is hard on the back, because you'll end up sleeping kind of curled forward. But it's something, doing an all-night meditation is something, probably worth experimenting with and trying to see if you find it beneficial. And then you can allow yourself to have a short sleep the next day. Try not to sleep the entire next day, or you kind of undo any benefit. Next question. When I try to keep the precept to not eat at inappropriate times, I end up feeling dull and weak. Yeah, the Buddha particularly addressed this, because after laying down that rule for the monks, that also then becomes the one of the 8 precepts. But it was first laid down as a precept for the monks, not to eat at afternoon. Some of the monks did end up feeling sick and dull and weak. And so the Buddha allowed the 5 tonics, So the 5 tonics are what would otherwise be classified as food that are allowable in the afternoon. That is sugar, honey, ghee, oil, and nawanitang. And honestly, no one in the modern times is really sure what nawanitang is, except it's some kind of a dairy product. So in the Thai tradition, which I follow, we interpret it as cheese. In Burma, they interpret it as butter. But these things would, without providing a lot of nutrition, they would raise your blood sugar a bit. So I think that's why some people are sensitive to blood sugar levels, and they need to have a little pick-me-up in the afternoon. You can still also take medicines, which includes like coffee and tea. What perfection can be achieved as someone practices Viriya Paramita? Well, yeah, that's one of the paramis, and perfection of energy is would be someone who is uh, beyond fatigue. You can just keep going. Ajahn, which chanting do you recommend when sleepy before meditation? Um, I like the Itipiso chant, and we do that here at Outer River. We do that daily in the morning. Itipiso Bhagawa Arahang Sama Sambuddho. But you could also do any chant that you like. Look through a book of paritas and choose one that you like and memorize it. Um, it's not so important which one you do, as long as you do it and kind of try and do it brightly and uh, with some energy behind it. Can you elaborate on the lion's pose? The lion's pose is the pose that the Buddha recommends for sleeping. That is lying on the right side with your head resting on your right hand, your left hand down your side of your body, the upper leg bent slightly at the knee. Now you can see images of that all over the place. Meditating, if you don't want to sleep, but you want to meditate in the lying posture, then you prop your head up on your elbow. Well, that in practice, that's very difficult. It's really hard on the wrist and elbow. After a while, you start to really feel discomfort. So it's difficult to maintain that posture for long, but it's recommended sleeping posture. It's said that sleeping in the lion's posture is the posture of a great man. Sleeping on the left side is the posture of a sensual man. Sleeping on the back is the consciousness of uh, brings up the consciousness of a hungry ghost, a peta. And sleeping on the belly is animal level consciousness. How much of metta versus anapana should be best for aversion types? Should be mostly metta. Any recommendations for hate type mind? Yeah, okay. For someone whose primary defilement is dosa, that is ill will, it manifests as anger, hatred, ill will, uh, irritation. Metta is the recommended practice, and you could take up metta as a primary practice for some time. And generally, besides practicing metta, you should don't forget, very important actually, aspect of metta is have metta towards yourself. Have loving kindness towards yourself, and don't be too hard on yourself. Don't be too self-critical. If you're a dosa type, you need to allow yourself to relax. It's the sensualist type, the type who's this loba, who's lost in the sense desire realm. They need more. They need to be more self-disciplined and more abstentious. To be a bit more ascetic, cut themselves off from sense pleasures. How do we rouse our overall Viriya levels? A good general rule is it's a kind of a positive feedback loop. You put in energy, you get energy. So if your overall Viriya levels are low, if you're kind of dull, first of all, sleep less, probably eat less, and uh, watch what kind of things you eat, and uh, do some exercise, some walking or even running, to try and um, you know energize the body. Ajahn, what age should one start not eat at afternoon? Asking as a teenager. Uh, you can start that at any age. I don't think there's any reason not to take up the practice. I would say that generally for people in the lay life, if you're working or going to school, you've got duties and things to do, it's probably not practical or even sensible to take up this practice all the time. But you can do it make a vow to do it for a weekend or for a week, to follow the 8 precepts. That's very beneficial. But I think trying to live a lay life in the world with responsibilities and duties and things to do, it's keeping the 8 precepts is not really very practical. Some few people manage it, but I think it's a lot to take on. To get rid of sleepiness, could you put yourself on a meditation schedule? How many times a day would you suggest? I think it's a very good idea to have a schedule, even if you're only meditating once a day, to have a fixed time and do it irregardless whether you feel like it or not. Make that a hard and fast rule. This time of day is my time for meditation. That's probably the single most important thing about maintaining a daily practice is that consistency. And if you do that, it becomes a habit, right? There is the habit tendency of mind that we tend to follow our habits. And a lot of times it's bad habits you fall into. You just keep doing it. But you can use that tendency of mind to your benefit by establishing good habits, wholesome habits. I don't really like to specify how many times a day or how long, because it varies so much on your circumstances and your capacity. If you're just starting out brand new, you probably not bite off more than you can chew. Start out easy and then build up to a more serious practice. I have a serious question. Until recently, my house was overrun with mice or rats. How do I deal with this issue without breaking the not kill precept? Thanks. Yeah, that's very difficult. And a lot of people face similar problems. There are ways of dealing with pests like that without killing them. You can live trap them and make the environment less hospitable to them. Be very careful not to leave any food out where they can get it, and check the building to see where they're getting in. See if you can seal any openings. And we face that problem with mice getting into our kitchen, and we're constantly working on live trapping them and driving them down the road and letting them go. Some places chant Itipiso 108 times. What are the advantages, if any, of taking up this practice? Yeah, we did that in Thailand a few times. That takes hours to do. It's actually quite it's quite energizing to do a long session of chanting like that, and it builds up your paramis. It builds up your adhitthana parami of determination, because you're taking on something that's kind of difficult, and you stick it through, then you've gained in that parami. Ajahn, are there any differences between suicide and murder in Buddhism? Well, both are violations of the first precept. There's no allowance for killing oneself. Acceptance is a very limited exception. If one is already an arahant and the body has reached a point where it's no longer worthwhile carrying it around, and then there's no harm, no foul in finishing the life. But for anyone who's not an arahant, suicide is still a gross violation of first precept and will lead to very likely lead to a lower rebirth. So if there's any difference between that and murdering another, it's perhaps maybe ethically a bit worse to murder another, but it's a fine distinction. I don't think there's any real serious distinction between the two. I use up large amounts of physical energy every day. I have become very skilled at it, however, it leaves me in a constant dull state without much mental energy. Is there any advice for such a problem? Well, I don't know your exact circumstances, but maybe you're overdoing the physical exertion, and you need to take more rests and make sure you have enough nutrition and liquids, especially. Okay, now I've missed several. I'm going to have to go back here. The chat's jumping down fast, and I've missed several. I've gone back in the list. Is there a kind of litmus test to know exactly what our main defilement is? Yeah, the Visuddhimagga actually goes into that for how to check for someone's defilement. And one of the methods is to wake somebody up suddenly when they're sound asleep, and the angry type person gets up saying, "What are you doing? What are you bothering me for?" Because I'm kind of in a fighting mood. The sensualist gets up really brightly and quickly, and what's going on. Wants to engage with whatever's happening. And the dull person or the deluded person is very hard to wake, and they smack their lips and go So it's it's ways like that expresses in personality. But I think you can see internally, you can see your own tendencies. And the three types is interesting. The three types unfold in different ways. I mentioned that the deluded type tends to develop psychic powers, and my own theory of that is that if a deluded person has some first germs, inklings of psychic power, like reading someone's mind or seeing at a distance, they'll go with it, whereas and develop it. Whereas the more rational, undiluted person would just dismiss it as being imagination and not ever nurture that seed. The sensual type tends to develop through faith faculty, and they love chanting and flowers and on the altar, and they turn their sensuality into exuberance of Dhamma. And the hate type develops through the intellect, because they're impatient at being ignorant. What is the best way to rouse and retain a mind bent on observing the tilakkhana, anicca dukkha anatta, from one moment to the next? I think that you have to come at it from a couple of different angles. One is a reflective angle to, and this is more kind of broad spectrum approach, is to, remind yourself of the impermanence and emptiness and unsatisfactoriness of things constantly. Not to fall into, and to notice when you're falling into a delusion of substantiality or permanence. But the other is the more subtle penetration, the penetration of those characteristics really come clearly observing reality and not imposing concepts on it. Is kind of tricky, but this is the essence of vipassana, is being present at this moment with this object of consciousness. What is this object right now? And not going into a thought formation about how it's impermanent or whatever, but just noticing the objects clearly. Then the characteristics become self-evident. They just come forward of their own. But it comes from seeing the object clearly without a grasping. It's important that there's not a grasping mind, because if you're grasping at it, or if you feel it's desirable, or the negative, if you feel it's scary or unpleasant, then you're going to be imposing the opposite factors. You're not going to see the emptiness or the imperfection or the impermanence. So another question about vermin. Where I live, there are lots of invasive insects that are in summer that are difficult to remove. Yeah, we have that too. We've got mosquitoes all over the place right now. It's really thick in Northern Ontario in June, especially. A couple of things I could say is, I make a practice of catching insects. A lot of times insects will go on the glass of the window. I catch them with a jar and a piece of cardboard, and I let them go outside. Mosquitoes, if they're indoors, if their house is well sealed, you won't get too many indoors. And I just let them bite. Once they finish biting, they just go away. They don't bother you anymore. It's a good way of learning compassion and patience and endurance. You think of them as your little teachers. Any practical advice on how to develop faith? Well, faith comes best from experience. As you advance in the path and you see the benefit of the Dhamma in your life, then you feel more faith in it. But also, it can encourage and develop faith to read the suttas. Make yourself familiar with the language of the suttas and the Buddha. And then you begin to really, they're so rich that you begin to really appreciate them, and that this will bring up forward faith. Do listening to Dhamma talks next to a dog have any benefit for the rebirth of the animal? That's actually possible. There's a story in the Visuddhimagga about a frog that crawled out of the pond while the Buddha was giving a talk, and it said that he couldn't, as being an animal, he couldn't understand anything, but he was somehow struck by something in the tone of voice, and he was listening to it when one of the men listening to the talk changed his posture and leaned on his staff, and he didn't look down. He accidentally killed the frog, and the frog was instantly reborn into Tawatingsa heaven. There's also a story about the disciples of Sariputta. He's the great disciple renowned for wisdom, and is generally considered the founder of Abhidhamma, and he had 50 disciples who he would expound Abhidhamma to in the beginning of the Abhidhamma tradition. And it's said that those 50 monks, in the many aeons ago, in the time of a previous Buddha, they had been bats living in a cave where a bhikkhu was doing walking meditation every day, reciting Abhidhamma as he walked. And that planted a seed that they've been in their karma, that later they were reborn as humans and became disciples of Sariputta. So it certainly couldn't do your dog any harm, at the very least. Is it stated in any sutta how Venerable Mahakassapa achieved parinibbana? Because I have read the book of the great disciples and did not mention it. I'm not sure. I don't recall the story of Mahakassapa's passing. See, practice not eating on the afternoon during Uposatha days. Look up when they are online. Yeah, that's a that's a very traditional practicing. The half-day fast on Uposatha days is actually a very traditional thing in Theravada countries. How to decide whether fears are rational or irrational? How to deal with rational and irrational fears? Well, fear, I'd take a kind of an extreme position and say fear is always irrational. There's nothing rational about fear. It just kind of cripples you. It's not a positive mind state in any circumstance. Of course, there are real and present dangers one has to deal with. But if you have a mind that's clear and awake and not agitated by panic or fear, you can deal with any kind of threat or danger more rationally. You can what's the best course of action for avoiding the danger. An arahant has no fear. Fear is a defilement. So I don't think you could really say there's any kind of rational fear. And certainly when fear arises, don't let it govern your mind. Don't be motivated by fear, because then you're going to make mistakes and things are going to be worse. I believe after my trauma due to verbal abuse and lots of unpleasant experience, my sankhara has increased. My sankhara of fear has increased, even though I experienced fortunate circumstances after these experiences. Well, that was part of the question I already answered. Next one. Anytime there's a bug in the house, you gently put them back outside, but we are forced to use liquid roach bait around the house. If I don't put anything out for roaches, they will overrun the house. Yeah, there's some. I know particularly I've known people who've in a restaurant. They really don't have any choice. The health department will shut them down. You recognize, don't make excuses for yourself. Still recognize that it's a breach of the precept, but you're kind of forced into the circumstance. You are breaking the precept, but we can't all be perfect all the time. I think it's better to just be honest with yourself and say, well, this situation has become intolerable. I'm going to break the precept and take my lumps. I have read that meditating on the sun is alike to Abhasara Brahma existence. Would that lead to PT and PT connected to Viriya? I heard PT is energetic. I don't know about meditating on the sun. I don't know if I'd recommend it. There is a Asian practice of sun gazing. It's not Buddhist. It's a Hindu thing, sun gazing. But if you really have to know what you're doing, you can hurt your eyes badly by looking at the sun. So I wouldn't take that up without doing a lot of research. Is there similarities between chitta and modern ideas of subconscious? Um, that's actually a very interesting question, and one that would take a long time to answer properly. There is really a big difference in that in the strict theory of Abhidhamma, there's only one mind moment of consciousness at a time. There isn't a subterranean stream of consciousness. There is no subconscious as such. There is only chitta. But what we experience as subconsciousness is the mind that is dull and is not fully aware, and maybe we escape from unpleasant things by being unaware of them, and the mind falls into the bhavanga state, which is the kind of neutral or idle state of mind. It's the state of deep sleep, but it's also the state we go in and out of during the day when there's nothing engaging the mind. And one who's really sharp and has a high degree of sati or mindfulness, there'd be very little bhavanga. But one who's dull and sleepy, they'd be in and out of bhavanga all the time. So the idea of a subconscious as a separate stream of consciousness that's going on at the same time as the fully conscious mind is alien to an Abhidhamma analysis. It's certainly not chitta, not the same thing. So I think we're kind of winding down. I'll leave it at that. And next week we're doing sati, mindfulness, and be back at the same time next week. Thank you all for coming.